Grüß, willkommen in einem of Fregen's video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 48 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be discussing using 1/72 scale plastic figures for figure gaming. My first exposure to figure gaming was when my cousin got me to purchase some airfixed German infantry, so he had an opponent for his British infantry, using a homegrown set of rules which used flipping of coins. After that experience, I was hooked, and I quickly built up a large collection of airfixed 1/72 scale infantry, as well as tanks and aircrafts, obviously. While I did spend many years using homegrown rules with my airfixed figures, I eventually moved on to board gaming and later lead figures. Where my collection is now, that is 1/72 scale airfixed plastic figures, I have no idea. I suspect it's deep in a rubbish tip somewhere. While I regret getting rid of my old 1/72 scale plastic figures, I didn't think much of it for many years. However, the idea of using 1/72 scale plastic figures is something I've been thinking a lot about just recently. The primary driver was an interest in building up a US Civil War force mix, and while I could go down the traditional path of 15mm or 6mm metal figures, I wanted to consider some different options. Initially I looked at the 13mm Warlord plastic figures, and I must admit they do look good, and I suspect that is the path I may end up taking. But I did decide to do some research on 1/72 scale figures first. For those interested, 1/72 scale figures, assuming the average height of a soldier was 180cm, would be considered as 25mm. However, when you compare them against 25mm metal figures, they often look small. So I would probably not mix and match the 25mm metal figures with 1/72 scale plastic figures, as they don't really match. But this does depend a bit on the manufacturer. This chart, which I found on the internet, seemed to imply that 1/72 is 24mm. However, the figure is a World War II figure, and if we go back to the 18th century, the story will change. If the average height of a man was 160cm back in the olden days, which may be much more reasonable for 18th century, the scale is about 22mm, which may explain why they are smaller than 25mm metal figures. Putting aside the actual scale, we'll assume they're 25mm figures. Now let's look at availability, starting with airfix figures. When I went looking in a recent catalogue, I was disappointed to not find any Ancients, Napoleonics or American Civil War figures. World War II was covered, and you can use these figures for that scale, but in this video I was focusing on Napoleonics and American Civil War, and the story is not so good for those periods. I did find very old figures on eBay, but the costs were so high that I decided it was not really viable. I thought at this point my search had ended, but then I discovered Italeri 1/72 figures in a hobby store. While my local hobby shop only had a few packets of these figures, the full range is rather impressive. Let's drill down a little bit more detail and let's look at one of the packets, in this case Austrian Infantry 1798 to 1805. For €10.50 you can get 48 infantry figures, which I have to admit is not cheap. I suppose you could use this to represent both line and light infantry as well. Unfortunately for me, there was no Austrian cavalry. You could use cavalry from other nationalities, which may not be perfect, but could get you to the point where you could create a Austrian force mix for a game. There was another packet of Austrian infantry, in this case simply called Austrian Infantry. This consisted of 47 infantry and one mounted figure, which could give you a commander at least. As you can see here, they used the old helmets, and you can see some figures are also grenadiers, so this gives you a reasonable range of the early Austrian infantry figures. There was also an Austrian and Russian command set, which contained adequate figures for commanders. There were three choices for artillery, 2 French packets and 1 British packet. Each seemed to contain 2 guns with crew, which could be foot or horse artillery, although more likely foot artillery. When looking at the full range, the best nationalities to select are French and British, although the Prussians are reasonable as well. The Austrians and Russians require using other nationalities' troops to fill out your ranks. This is not perfect, but can get you a game. If you're an experienced gamer familiar with metal figures, this limited range is not going to excite you. However, the purpose of this video is to provide a guideline for new players, as one advantage of plastic figures is you may be able to find them in your local hobby shop, and being plastic may be considered more user-friendly for novice gamers. There is another brand, s3e48, which may allow you to fill out your range. The number of figures in each packet is 6, so it appears the quality is very high, as you can see here, but the cost is also very high. I have to admit they can paint up very nicely indeed, but at $12 US per packet on Amazon, I'm uncertain if this is what new gamers would be interested in, considering its high cost. Other suppliers I found are Kaiser and Het, but Kaiser does not seem to have any Napoleonic figures I could see. On the other hand, Het seemed to have a very good range. I am certain you could create whatever force mix you need with this range of figures. Special thanks to one of the viewers of my videos, Hordes of Things, who informed me that there was a Napoleonic range from this company. This got me looking and I was surprised at the range. The cavalry box includes 12 mounted figures, while the infantry contains 48 figures. This is a rather good ratio. The cost is also reasonable. The Het site that I looked at is rather basic, but many hobby stores offer this range, so you can see the full range on their site. There's also an excellent site which lists all the 172 plastic figures, which is https://www.howjust.de. I'll leave a link in the notes. For now, let's just stay with Italy. Once you have your figures, how do you base them? If you're using skirmish rules, then the answer is reasonably simple. Use round bases, which can accommodate your figures. I'd look at the rules you are using and use the base sizes for 25mm figures in this particular case. However, how do you base your figures if you're uncertain of the rules you'll be using, skirmish, company, or whatever scale, especially if you do not wish to go down the skirmish path? While this does depend on the rules, you should plan on ensuring all your bases have the same width, if at all possible. The depth can vary based on the figure, so cavalry is deeper than infantry and artillery is probably the deepest of them all. The topic of basing is a rather wide one, and I've created videos on the history of how it has changed and diverged. But in simple terms, you have the choice of what I call the US system or the UK system. The Age of Eagles rules provide the best view of the US system, although this system did come from an earlier set of rules called Napoleon's Battles. In this case, the base widths do differ, which is not an issue if you're using these rules, but if you use other rules, may be a problem. This shows the basing sizes for 15mm, which is what I'm mainly familiar with. For our 25mm figures, you could try and fit them on these base sizes, but they're not going to fit. I'd use a 4cm width instead, as a standard width. This is not a good solution, as it does not really align with any specific set of rules, but is certainly one option. I'd personally select your rules and just simply use the 25mm basing, whatever the rules suggest. The basing system, which I call the British system, uses a common width of 6cm for 25mm infantry and cavalry, but does use a 4cm width for artillery. I normally base everything as 6cm wide for simplicity, but as artillery is rare and often is not in the front lines, this may not be an issue if you want to base them 4cm width instead of 6cm width. Before you do decide to base your figures, you may wish to define what type of game you wish. Do you want to reproduce an entire battle, a part of a battle, or is the game you are interested in more a focus on playing the game rather than history, like a game of chess, for example? In my case, I want a game which can complete within 4 to 6 hours and allows me to reproduce an entire battle, even if the battle is hypothetical. In order to achieve this, each side should have about 50 elements, perhaps between 48 and 52 on average, across the entire game, which lasts about 12 game turns. A minimum size playing area would probably need to be 4 by 6 feet, or 120cm by 180cm for figures of this size. If players want to achieve a different objective, the number of elements and the playing area size may vary, but using my example, we have a good objective to at least initially aim for. In this case, each side will probably require 200 figures, which if we use artillery would require 4 packets of figures for a total cost of about €42. If we are fielding both sides, we are looking at a possible budget of €84. We should round this up to about €100 to cover the extra cost of cavalry, artillery and special figures, as well as obviously basing. The rules I would initially think of using would be large-scale rules such as Snappy Nappy, Volume Bayonet, Polemos Napoleonic, Marshal of the Emperor, or BBNB. Some of these rules are better suited to 6mm, but that does give you an idea of the type of rules I would at least initially look at. Other players may decide otherwise. For this exercise or video, I'm going to use a figure game conversion of a popular SPI board game called Napoleon at War, which I call Grosse Schlachten. I've totally rewritten the rules to suit figure gaming and renamed it for copyright reasons. But in terms of the basic game system, it mirrors the SPI board game very closely. You can even refight the SPI board game scenarios if you so desire. The initial basing system I used was DBN, as the rules I've selected does not care about basing as long as all bases are the same width. It will work. I think if I redid this, I would go with a US basing, which means that it's narrower, deeper elements, that's infantry, and you have 2 ranks, which actually I think gives me a better game. But nonetheless, the reason why I initially went with DBM is to allow me to use these figures for other rules as well, which also allows me to use the rules with Snappy Nappy, BB&B, and just in case. It also allows me to use the figures from the old WRG Musket and Pike rules, as well as a wide range of other lower-scaled UK-centric rules. If you didn't care so much about UK-based Napoleonic rules, I would personally go with the US basing system. However, for this video, I went with the UK basing system. This represents the minimum size you should consider. You can easily increase the depth of any base to fit the figure on it, or to enhance its aesthetics. You could try a base width of 5 centimeters, which does have some advantages, but then you move into a basing size which few other rules use, and you're pretty much locking yourself out of playing with a lot of other players with their own 25mm force mixers. If you wish to use the US basing system, which I would advise, you could adopt a double depth base, as you can see on the left, which DBN does as well. This base can be split into 2 separate bases, as you can see on the right, which is actually the US basing system on the right. This structure works with BB&B and Grosse Schlachten, at least for the line infantry and skirmishers. For light infantry, you would place 3 figures on each half element size base. Let's look at the impact on cavalry, or of cavalry. If using the double depth infantry bases, you could align the cavalry bases to the same depth, as you can see on the left. On the right, you can see the half bases. It should be noted with the US basing system, you use the basing that you see on the left. You don't normally use half bases as you do with infantry. So I would probably use the basing system on the left. While it's advisable to have all the bases the same width, there is no reason why you can't have multiples of base widths. Thus, keeping the cavalry with a width of 6 centimeters does work with pretty much most rules. The base width for the game could be either 3 centimeters or 6 centimeters. If you're using a base width based set of rules, the base width would be 6 centimeters. The same could apply with the artillery. The basing system does give you maximum flexibility to be used as many different sets of rules as possible. Because Grosse Schlachten can use both 6 centimeter wide and 3 centimeter wide elements, I would probably go with the 3 centimeter wide bases, particularly for the infantry. This would allow me to reduce the number of figures I need to purchase. However, even if I went with the narrower base for infantry, I would probably stay at 6 centimeters for artillery and cavalry, simply because that's what I would need for other sets of rules, such as Napoleon's battles, etc. If you're going to do anything unusual, it's highly unlikely you'll find many opponents. So if you're going to go down this path, you may need to build up both force mixes. If other players become interested and build up their own force mix, all the better. However, you need to recruit these players unless you have enough figures to show how the game works with your new figures. Your single army is going to look pretty lonely unless you find some old WRG Musket and Pike players at your club, which tends to be rarer and rarer each day. As I personally have more Napoleonic force mixes in other scales than I care to consider, I am going to pursue the plastic figure path with an American Civil War force mix, possibly using 172 plastic figures. And so we come to an end of episode 52 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case building up a plastic 172 scale force mix. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.